Freedom rides. I would definitely say it's worth, if you're doing a question about freedom rides, to talk about certainly the huge success that it was, but also you need to mention about the level of violence that they underwent. The reason they had the idea for the freedom rides, and hopefully you got this from the film The Butler, because when we watched that I wanted to give you an overview of what was happening at this time. In 1960 there had been several very successful sit-ins at white lunch counters and also outside of white restaurants. It had been really successful in 1960 doing things like that, peaceful protest, and the people involved in those were the SNCC. They were the Student Non-Violent Coordinating Committee, but you only need to remember the letters, don't worry about writing it all out in full. So due to that early success in 1960, they decided to do a summer of freedom rides. Now remember, the freedom rides were only in the summer of 1961. If you're talking about it any other time, you're getting it wrong. It was only a very short time period that they did these for. And as I go further with this, you'll realise why that was the case. So what happened is they decided to test the law that was meant to be in 1961. All interstate buses were meant to have been desegregated. So segregation on these buses was meant to be illegal. However, many black African Americans realised that this actually was not the case, and this was a real shame. So what they did is they tried to test the law. So some students, and these were all integrated by the way, blacks and white sympathisers did this, would go on these interstate buses, and they always boarded them in the northern states. Because in the northern states there wouldn't be any issues with blacks and whites sat together, because obviously we know there was no segregation laws in the north anyway. So they were boarded at places like Chicago or Washington DC. Then what would happen was they would then take a bus deliberately through the southern states that were the most racist. So we're talking in the heart of KKK country here. We're talking like Alabama, Tennessee, places like that. So what they did is they used to start in the north, and often these rides could take obviously days. And sometimes it got so bad, the violence towards them when they got to the southern states, at times the drivers would leave them and they'd have to find a new driver. And at one point they even took a flight to board a bus somewhere else so they could continue this freedom ride. So in the southern states, tragically, what happened is the KKK came out in force. They obviously gave them racial abuse, they threatened them, they went on and they beat people up. In Birmingham, Alabama, the person who was in charge, Bull O'Connor, who was the police chief there, gave the KKK 15 minutes to go in and beat up as many black African Americans as they could, and then he sent his police in. This sort of thing was institutional racism, and it was terrible, but it was something that was constantly being televised to America. And one thing the freedom rides really did is it gained huge amounts of publicity and embarrassed the American government. How could a country condone violence like this? In one instance, which was absolutely terrible, a freedom bus actually did get completely and utterly burnt out. Luckily nobody was killed, but it was more luck than actually, it being planning that wouldn't happen, because I'm sure members of the KKK would have been more than happy for that to have taken place. The freedom riders sometimes got interviewed about why they were doing it, and obviously they would do the interviews and they were all beaten up and they all were wounded, and they were explaining about why they were trying to test the laws. Because fundamentally the southern states of America really thought they could do what they like. Very similar to what happened with Little Rock, they just thought that the rules didn't really apply to them. And it was a group of brave individuals, just over 300 freedom riders there was that summer, that managed to change people's opinions of what should be happening on those interstate buses.